Today we want to talk about the notion of ecosystem health and how it is used and misused in science and policy in ecological areas as well as natural resources. The idea of applying the human health metaphor to ecological policy problems is a very appealing one. There's an awful lot known about the human well-being, how to measure it, and also the public has a very clear understanding of what a healthy person is versus an unhealthy person. Now, there's arguments around the edges of exactly what health means, but basically when you say someone is healthy, most people have a pretty good idea what that means. For example, if we have a person who might be 100, we don't expect the same vital signs as a person who might be 1 or 10. So whether you're 1, 10, or 100, there's a general idea among the general public about what healthy means. Similarly, if we could apply that idea, that notion, to ecosystems, perhaps we could come up with a concept called ecosystem health, which might be similarly useful. Well, using ecosystem health, at least the notion, has a lot of inherent appeal. Some of the positive features that are offered for this are it's intuitively appealing. It's an easy metaphor to explain to people. People get the concept of something as healthy, whatever it is. They get an idea it's a good condition, a healthy condition, something that's desirable. Also, it focuses on what might be important to the public. For example, if we have an ecosystem and an agency is trying to convince folks that we ought to take a particular management intervention to protect the yellow-crested slug, that might be a tough sell. But if you go to the public and saying, we are doing these things in order to improve or sustain ecosystem health, that has a lot more appeal. Similarly, it actually works. It actually does help to sell policy positions. If an organization, an advocacy group, a government agency wraps their policy preference in terms of ecosystem health, they are on the side of the good guys, the angels, if you will. Also, there's an apparent scientific basis. Usually, notions of ecosystem health are brought to you by people who look like scientists, they sound like scientists, and therefore people assume they're scientists. And further than that, perhaps we should let the scientists decide these issues rather than political people, policymakers, or the general public. But there are some problems with applying this metaphor, and those are the ones that we want to talk about today. If we look at this painting, which is worth apparently a lot of money, you look at it and you say, well, I'm not really sure what it is. I mean, it must be something because everybody talks about this painting and it's worth a lot of money, and therefore I don't see it, but maybe there is something here that is just over the horizon that I'm missing. It's similar with a healthy ecosystem. Exactly what is a healthy ecosystem? Well, let's look at some examples. Here we have a wetland off the coast of Georgia. It's an area that's never had people. It's pristine. There's absolutely no effects of humans any way, shape, or form. And when you ask people about this particular ecosystem, almost everybody will say it's a healthy ecosystem. Let's look at another example. Here we have a bunch of lakes and ponds, tundra in Alaska, and this is a remote part of Alaska. Even by Alaskan standards, this is a remote area. No effects of humans. Perhaps there's a little bit of airborne pollution coming from China through the upper atmosphere, but barely detectable. So for all intents and purposes, it's an area that has zero human effects. And when you ask members of the general public about this, they will almost universally say, these are healthy ecosystems, or this is a healthy area. Following along that vein, if we go to the northern Rockies and find this lake, which is very remote, it's never been or rarely been visited by humans. There's no discernible effects of humans whatsoever. In short, it's far off the beaten path. In fact, it's so far off the beaten path, there is no path to it. So the effects of humans are essentially zero. And if you would ask 100 people in the general public and say, is this a healthy ecosystem? They would almost universally say it is. Let's look at one more. This is the Pacific Northwest, and this is an old growth forest. Then this area, spotted owls they love this area. Similar species that like old growth forests are prospering. And so for all intents and purposes, if you ask people, is this area healthy? They'll say this land, this area, this ecosystem is in fact healthy. But let's look at that last one a little more intensely. Here we have it. It's performing pretty much like old growth forests do. But if you look 90 degrees to the left, you see another area, which is essentially the same land where the trees have been removed, they've been harvested, and grasslands have come in. Now, spotted owls don't like it as much as they do the old growth forest, but other bird species like it a lot more, and they're prospering, whereas spotted owls are doing less well. Also, deer, elk, browsers, they love it too, and they're prospering. So which condition, again, it's essentially the same land, which condition is healthier? Well, when you ask this question, people will typically follow by a question to you, and that is, well, what's the purpose of the land? What's the goal? What's your objective? And so it depends. It depends pretty much what the assumption of the goal is if somebody in the public will say this area is healthy or degraded. Well, is using ecosystem health as a concept really a corruption in science? Again, policy advocates, people who are pitching a policy preference, they're trying to sell something, they can use whatever words or concepts or notions they want. I mean, there really are no clear rules to follow. Like in any marketing, if you're trying to sell your policy preference, you do whatever you think works. But for scientists, we generally expect scientists to present policy neutral science, and that is science that's not involved or inculcated with a policy preference. So is using the notion of ecosystem health really a corruption of science? Well, my short answer is yes. It does not inform policy deliberations accurately. And does that? The reason is because there is, by definition, a built-in policy preference. One particular condition is defined as desirable, preferable, and by implication, the alternatives are not. It's also policy bias science because there is that embedded policy preference. The scientist, the policy neutral person, has made an assumption about which policy preference must be preferred. It also obscures real trade-off. All policy making in natural resources, ecosystem fields involve picking winners and losers. And when you inculcate science with embedded policy preferences, those trade-offs are often hidden from the public and decision makers. Using concepts like ecosystem health are in fact preempting the moral high ground. After all, if you can describe your policy preference as one of ecosystem health, what are the alternatives? Ecosystem sickness, degraded? This is not a good situation for somebody to be in when your policy preference is described as one that's sick or degraded. Further, the policy process using notions like ecosystem health, metaphors like this, often ends up being controlled by the policy elite. Because we are the ones, those with advanced degrees, those of us involved with government agencies or NGOs, we are the ones that describe what ecosystem health is because we are the ones with advanced degrees. We know the jargon, we're employed in these fields, and so it is our values and preferences that get embedded in the science. And so it's us that tend to control the elite, not the public or not political decision makers, where in a democracy is where it typically lies. Well, if ecosystem health is a poor metaphor for science, why is it used? Good question. First, there are many reasons why scientists, again, advocates can use whatever techniques, including misusing science, whatever they want to sell our policy preference. Here we're talking about scientists presenting science. Well, some reasons. One is unintentional, and that is people don't even know they're using it. They don't realize it, and if they do realize it, hey, it's not my problem. If you misinterpret the science, that's your problem. Another reason, possible reason, personal policy preferences. that particular scientists may have strong personal policy preferences and they are somehow not compartmentalized from the scientific activity. They are in fact embedded in the science. Thirdly, professional pressure. We all belong to professional groups, and there is a subtle, sometimes not so subtle, pressure to go with the flow. We all pretty much are on the same page, and so there's really not a lot of deviation from the norm, if you will. Essentially, the peer pressure, subtle as it may be, the peer pressure influence. There's also organizational pressures. Very few of us are independently wealthy, so we usually work for somebody, and that somebody, that organization, government or private, tends to have policy preferences. And so there are sometimes subtle pressures and sometimes not so subtle pressures to be a team player. Pitch the company's policy preference. Don't present science that's going to undermine our position. Well, let me wrap up with two conclusions. The first is the notion of ecosystem health is a textbook example of normative science. Now, normative science is information that looks like science, it sounds like science, it's usually presented by people who call themselves scientists, but in fact it is not science. It is what looks like science that is embedded with a built-in policy preferences. And in the case we talked about here, the policy preference is that pristine ecosystems unaffected by humans, are somehow intrinsically superior to the ones that are affected by humans. Now, ecosystems that are altered by humans are definitely different than non-altered ecosystems, but they are not better or worse until you apply a value judgment, a policy preference. Hence the term normative, i.e. value-based information. Secondly, do not use this metaphor to convey scientific information. Describe the ecosystems the way they are, what the alternatives are, without embedded an implied policy preference that one particular state is inherently better scientifically than another. Thank you.